The Riel rebellions actually refers to two rebellions, the Red River and the Northwest Rebellion. The topic of this video, however, will be purely about the former. The Red River settlement was located between the Red and Assiniboine River, in the lower part of what we now call Manitoba. The colony, after 1821, has become remarkably stable. The people living there included the Metis, Aboriginal, Scottish and Swiss colonists, as well as the Hudson's Bay Company employees. For the sake of this video, we'll focus mainly on the Metis. The Red River colony was owned by the Hudson's Bay Company and was very isolated. Thus, being more concerned about self-sufficiency, the Red River colony became a multiracial society. Sure, there were continual conflicts about race, religion, and class, but as a whole, the colony was very accepting and had a small-town mentality. This was surprising for the time, as many of the ideals we want our current society to reflect have been achieved in this small colony. As time went on, the tightly knit and isolated community's population quickly became mainly composed of those of mixed descent. But as all good things must come to an end, the peace would not last forever. The Red River settlement existed within Rupert's Land, which covered a good chunk of North America. Canada had a great interest in annexing Rupert's Land. This was partly due to the fact that Canada wanted to spread its borders west, and partly due to the fact there were fears of the US annexing Rupert's Land first. And sure enough, Canada and the HBC began negotiations about the sale of Rupert's Land. The problem with all of this is that the original residents weren't informed. In fact, during negotiations, they were considered non-existent. From the perspective of the Canadian government, these people did not have any official title to their land, and therefore technically didn't own it. The government also wrongly assumed that they would get integrated into the powerful British culture without a second thought. Also keep in mind, Canada was quite weak and small compared to the US. Purchasing Rupert's Land was a quick way to expand its territory, and in Canada's case, time was of the essence. And dealing with more people would just slow them down. The government continued to keep this a secret from the original residents, at least until the summer of 1869. When surveyors arrived, and the Métis were able to find out what the government was planning, and boy were they terrified. The Métis people feared they would lose control of their homelands, their culture, religion, and land rights. They were losing everything by joining the Confederation, and were gaining nothing in the progress. The government chose not to negotiate with the Métis because they were of Aboriginal descent, and they weren't really required to win over to get the land. Many of the residents owned no deeds, and therefore didn't have anything to fall back on. Their mixed blood made the government see them as inferior compared to the British. A good example of this was how the surveyors chose to use the grid system used by Britain rather than the already established seigneur system. However, soon, in all of this, a man would rise to the occasion. To stop the takeover of the Red River settlement, Riel rallied others around him to stop the Canadian representatives from entering the colony. Louis Riel was an educated man born in October 22nd of 1844 in St. Boniface, Red River settlement. He was an outstanding student and was given the opportunity to study in Montreal. Whilst there, he fell in love and got engaged with a woman named Marie Julie Gernon. However, her parents refused to allow a Métis man to marry their daughter, and thus the engagement was broken off. This act of racial discrimination showed Riel the plight of his people. Riel, assuming the leadership of the Red River militants, prevented William McDougall, a Canadian expansionist, and a land survey party from entering. The government, however, didn't take the opposition all too seriously. However, they did delay the time of the formal transaction. It's easy to see why the Canadian government didn't care too much about the complaints. At the time, seemed to be a light squabble that could easily be fixed. After all, the Métis wouldn't put up a large resistance. They were nowhere nearly as united as the Canadian government and would change their mind. That was the condescending thinking that sparked the rebellion. If the government simply chose, at the very least, to acknowledge the original residents' existence and to negotiate a bit more readily, the transfer of power would have been quite painless. While the people would still be afraid of losing some power, they could take refuge in the fact that the government was willing to negotiate, instead of pretending they didn't exist. But this was not the case. The government never saw them as anyone worth their time. Their excuses ranged from race to religion to culture. The Métis were rightly terrified. They could be losing their farms and, more importantly, their identity. If they backed down now, they would be at risk of a total English-Canadian domination, a price they could not afford. On November 3, 1869, Riel seized Fort Garry, the main trading post of the HBC. There, he arrested a few Ontarians, including a Thomas Scott. Riel kept them as prisoners inside of Fort Garry. The plan was to keep the fort until the Canadian government agreed to negotiate. Riel, along with some of his allies, set up a provisional government, where he emerged as the main spokesperson for the Métis. Then, on November 19, 1869, the Hudson's Bay Company signed a deed that will transfer the land to the Crown. The Crown will then cede the land to Canada. However, due to the continued political disruption, Canada refused to assume control of the area on December 1st, as originally agreed. Truth be told, Riel and his supporters had no intention of rebelling against Canada. They wanted to make sure that they'll be able to keep their rights and traditions, something they'd lose if they let the transfer happen as is. He didn't really have any qualms about entering the Confederation. Rather, he and others feared that all the power would be given to the Canadian Party and the Métis would be left voiceless. The government certainly didn't do its share of ending the turmoil. Much of the problems would have been solved by simply agreeing to some of the terms set out by the Métis. As stated, they weren't trying to be a new country. They just wanted to keep their identity. And soon, December rolled around and the year was almost over. Riel wanted to protect the Métis and all the groups living in the settlement. Remember them? Well, they weren't seen all that favorable in the eyes of the Brits. Some better than others, but many were under discrimination from the country. Thus, the Métis' list of rights were adopted by the provisional government at a meeting in Fort Garry on 1869 December 1st. What's amazing, though, is that many of these rights made it to the present day in the form of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, a document that was built to apply to more people, but still shares some common ideology with the Métis document. Okay, back to the rebellion. Riel was afraid of the possibility of a civil war. The Canadian government had already armed and prepared to attack. So, Riel led a party to John Schultz's home, which at the time was a Canadian Party headquarters, and Schultz was taken to Fort Garry as a hostage. In spite of all this, Prime Minister John A. Macdonald still refused to recognize Riel, and was much less willing to negotiate with him. Still, the Métis were going to great lengths to fight for their rights and freedom, working to convince those who looked down upon them that they were all equals. After almost an entire year, the Canadian government finally begins the negotiations with the Métis. Before then, the government negotiated land as if no one lived there. The government never saw the Métis as a race deserving of political power. And now, after a year, the Métis, who were completely fine with joining Canada as long as some basic rights were met and some traditions were kept, were finally getting the negotiations they wanted as the original residents. This whole rebellion was what allowed the voiceless to be able to speak. However, Riel's biggest slip-up was about to occur. On March 4th, 1870, Thomas Scott was executed via firing squad. While being held as a hostage, Thomas verbally and physically abused the guards, and publicly talked about his anti-Métis view. Because of this, he was charged with disobeying the provisional government. It's important to note that Riel and his followers haven't executed a single person up to this point. The rebellion had remained mainly bloodless. Many on the settlement regretted the execution. This hurt the public image of the Métis. To take advantage of this, the Orange Order spread the rumor that the execution was of a martyr being killed by the cruel Métis. However, even with these rumors, the Canadian authorities were still willing to negotiate with them. But now, they refused to provide unconditional amnesty to Riel and the other leaders. On July 15, 1870, the Manitoba Act was finally passed. Some of the conditions from the Métis' list of rights were included. The government had finally agreed to the terms of Manitoba's admission into the Confederation. Macdonald refused to allow provincial control over public lands. However, a swath of land was given to the Métis as compensation. The right to access both French and English resources was allowed to be safeguarded, along with equal rights towards Roman Catholics and Protestants. This was a long way from pretending the residents didn't exist. And on May the 2nd, Manitoba was passed by the House of Commons as a province, not a territory as Macdonald originally wanted. But while the English government was still discriminatory towards the Métis, progress was being made. John A. Macdonald sent a force of 12,000 to Winnipeg under the command of Colonel Wolseley to help keep the peace while the transfer was happening. They were given clear and strict instructions to make sure to treat Riel and his followers as not being a true government. When they arrived in late August, the troops found no resistance from the Métis people. Riel had fled, fearing that staying would result in his execution. Eventually, all the members of the provisional government were given amnesty, all except Riel, who was decreed to be banished for 5 years. After over a year of fighting for the equality of his people, it seemed as if Riel retired as quickly as he came. The story of the Red River Rebellion shows how the government was discriminatory towards an entire group of people. The government refused to recognize the rights of the Métis and the rights to their land because of their race, culture, and society. These were all seen as inferior to the British way of life. In the end, it was a rebellion, so not all the rights the Métis requested were met. But the fact that the Manitoba Act included some of the Métis' suggestions was a long way off from when the government negotiated their land away as if no one was living there. From what I see, the story of the rebellion shows how the government needs to respect its people. Well, that's all the time I have for today. See you next time. Or never. Oh, you're still here? Well, if you're wondering what happened to Riel, after the Northwest Rebellion, he was executed for treason against the government. You know, standard stuff for a rebellion leader back then.